webinar will be starting in 1 minute, and I am going to launch a poll, and then Kara Marcus will be providing you some intro information about how to use Zoom.
Thank you, Robin, and welcome everybody to Best Practices in Cost Allocation, a webinar in partnership with AASHTO, MTAP, and RLS. So some of you might have noticed that your Zoom was upgraded today or updated, but it still hopefully will work fine. Please keep yourself in mute mode. You can either, you'll get a audio, there's the poll, an audio preference, and you could either use your computer or a phone. If you would like to give us feedback or ask a question, you can enter it into the chat. This one does not seem to have a Q&A, so both technical questions and feedback, as well as content questions and feedback, can all be entered into the chat. When we come to the Q&A section, we will address your questions in the panel session. Does anybody have any questions about Zoom? Okay, onward to the show. Robin.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm Robin Phillips, and I'm the Executive Director of National RTAP, and I work with Kira and I work with these other people here to help bring the information to you that you need for compliance, and also to get a handle on how things are working. Today we have 3 really amazing panelists and 1 really amazing one amazing partner, MTAP, and we will be basically going over the agenda here, and we'll go over what cost allocation is with Rich Garrity, and then we will talk about what's going on in Pennsylvania and Vermont, and there will be time for questions at the end. For those of you who don't know about National RTAP, we provide technical assistance and training. Our trainings are available to anyone, but they're focused and scaled to rural and tribal operators. All of our things are free, and we actually have a cost allocation calculator on our site. So if you are so excited by cost allocation that you think, how can I make it even better for me? You can go to our site and find out more about our cost allocation calculator. So here is Richard. Oh, I got the wrong slide. There we go.
I'll leave it as Zoom to screw that one up. Thanks, Robin. I appreciate it. My name is Richard Price, and I'm the staff liaison for AASHTO's Council on Public Transportation and the Multi-State Transit Technical Assistance Program. And first, let me just say thank you to Robin and thank you to National RTAP for co-partnering on this, or partnering on this webinar, and being great leaders on this particular issue. We appreciate it. I want to thank our panelists today. Your knowledge and expertise on cost allocation is invaluable. And more importantly, I want to thank all the participants today in today's webinar, because without you, frankly, we wouldn't be needing a webinar now, would we? But I'm glad we're on board. And next slide, please. And just a quick about the Council on Public Transportation. Well, technically, we are the policymaking body for AASHTO on public transportation. We focus on outreach to Capitol Hill in Congress, Federal Transit Administration in terms of regulatory agendas, and we do all that outreach involving public policy related to statewide transit programs. Next slide, please. And the council actually has the Multi-State Transit Technical Assistance Program, commonly called MTAP. We are the technical services program for transit, and we have about 46 to 48 members annually join our program. Our chair is Don Chartok with Washington State. Our vice chair is Caitlin McClanahan with Tennessee DOT. And we do a number of things similar to things like this, which is host educational forums for our members. And again, I want to say thank you for everybody and their attendance today. And now back to Robin.
thanks. I was just gonna end the poll and so I can share results. Okay, can everybody see the poll? Do you see the poll? No. Yes, thank you, Kara. Okay, so onward and upward. Our next panelist, our opening panelist is Rich Garrity from RLS. He is the beginning alpha and the omega of cost allocation, cost sharing, financial management, strategic planning strategic budgeting. We are very lucky to have him today to talk about and give us an overview of what is cost allocation, how do we do it with transit, and what are the different issues we need to be aware of as we move forward, trying to comply and trying to understand how to manage our budgets. So thank you, Rich.
All right, thank you, everyone. And Robin, can you confirm that our slideshow is visible?
I am seeing it.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today on the topic of cost allocation. In the brief time that I have available to me this afternoon, we're going to talk a little bit about why cost allocation is such a problematic and difficult issue for us to seemingly get our hands around. We'll talk about some key concepts in developing indirect cost allocation plans. We'll talk about procedural steps and some of the pitfalls and errors that I have seen in the conduct of our practice. And then we'll close out at the end of the presentation looking at some potential best practices for state DOTs and local transit agencies. And then I'm going to turn it over to two states in today's session who will talk about these very issues as they play out in their respective states. So one of the things that I always like to begin anytime we discuss cost allocation is trying to get everybody on the same page. I've had the pleasure of teaching various cost allocation workshops over my professional career, and I can tell you that if I'm teaching a webinar and I've got 10 to 15 people in the room and I ask them their definition of cost allocation, it's likely that I'm going to get 10 to 15 different answers to my question. And the curious thing is that none of those answers may be wrong. So I think it's very useful that we take a look at this broad issue that we tend to stick the label of cost allocation to and look at it from the perspective that there are issues that are financial based and there are cost allocations that are service based. And I think it's important to understand what that distinction is. When we talk about financial based cost allocation methodologies, we're really talking about devices that are known as central service cost allocation plans and indirect cost allocation plans. And for the most part, transit managers per se will not be the honchos of our organization's efforts to develop financial-based cost allocation strategies. This will be more in the province of our CFO, our finance directors, and the like, which may be fortunate because these can be very complex allocation plans. A central service allocation plan typically relates to state and local governments. And using my graphic attached to this slide, as you can see, we have a hypothetical county organization that
Rich?
has various support departments. Yes?
I am just seeing your entry slide. Is this your, I'm just seeing the first slide. There we go. Here we go. Phew. Okay.
Very good. Thank you for reminding me of that. I'm hitting the wrong button to advance slides, the new Zoom. So in our graphic here, we have various support departments: legal, finance, human resources, IT, and these are central service departments of the local government that provide meaningful services to the operating departments of this county government, such as fire and EMS, public works, where our transit department is located, the health department, law enforcement, our library, and the like. And if we want to develop an estimate of the contribution of those central service departments to these operating departments, then we need to develop a central services cost allocation plan. And again, this is typically a financial-based allocation strategy uniquely related to state governments and larger local governments. Most smaller cities and counties will not take the trouble to develop a central services cost allocation plan. And that is understandable. They're very complex. They can run into the hundreds of pages in terms of the actual plan itself. And it may not be worth it to the local governing board of those jurisdictions to prepare a central service cost allocation plan. However, if we are practitioners of full cost recognition in the operation of our transit programs, we would certainly advocate that the local government develop such plans. Now we turn our attention to the second of the two financial-based cost allocation methodologies. This is the one that we may be more familiar with, and that is an indirect cost allocation plan. And this is typically a strategy where we develop a technique or a methodology to allocate the shared costs of our organization to the benefiting programs within our department or within our nonprofit organization. Notice I did not mention nonprofits in the discussion of central service cost allocation plans. However, indirect cost allocation plans are equally appropriate for nonprofit organizations as well as state and local governments. And again, what we primarily are looking for in an indirect cost allocation plan is a description of the methodology by which we will allocate in an equitable manner our overhead and administrative costs that benefit all the operating programs, departments, or services of our organization. And this, of course, may include transit. One important distinction: if we are to claim indirect costs under any federal grant award that we may be awarded through our state DOT, acting as a pass-through agency, or if we're a larger organization and we are a direct recipient of FTA funds from our respective regional offices, then the only way that we can claim indirect costs is if such costs are consistent with an approved indirect cost allocation plan. And we'll talk a little bit about those processes in a later slide. Now that we've talked and given a very quick and high-level overview of financial-based cost allocation, we also, in particular in transit, are confronted with a number of problematic issues that fall under the category of service-based cost allocation strategies. So for example, if we are a transit agency that provides fixed route service, by law, the ADA requires us to also operate complementary paratransit services. And when it comes time at year end to file that NTD report, and we do our best to provide accurate data to the Federal Transit Administration, NTD requires us to allocate certain shared expenses between the two modes of service using a service-based allocation strategy. Another opportunity that may precipitate the need for a cost allocation plan is if we provide service under contract to a local human service agency. We've participated in that planning process that requires certain 5310 recipients to develop a coordinated Human Services Public Transportation Plan. And in the course of that planning process, we identify opportunities where human service agencies may want to buy transit services from our transit agency. We've got to develop a cost of service. We do not want to essentially cross-subsidize senior transportation or agency-specific transportation, and we are going to want to arrive at a cost or price for that service that represents what my transit agency actually incurs in the delivery of that service. And that is a service-based cost allocation problem. And then for those of you who read FTA Circular 9040.1G, the guidance for the Rural Formula Program, it notes in Chapter 3 that a recipient of 5311 funds or a recipient of Section 5307 funds, the Urban Formula Program, an entity could receive grants under both programs. And when that circumstance arises, FTA expects the organization to develop a, quote, cost allocation plan that will equitably distribute operating and capital costs between the two respective FTA programs. And when there is any question about the methodologies or the parameters in that cost allocation plan, FTA will look to the state DOT to arbitrate and resolve any issues in that cost allocation plan. And there are, to my last count, over 200 organizations nationwide who do receive both 5307 and 5311 financial assistance that this third bullet point will apply. So these are three very concrete, everyday examples of service-based cost allocation that could confront an organization. And I've got some more description here of those three scenarios. We're always wanting to know the cost of a transit service. How do we accurately fulfill our NTD requirements, reporting requirements, and the like? And there is our infamous graphic. This is not my graphic, but I stole this from the Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility. And this was back in the day when the CCAM identified 64 different programs that funded human services transportation. So service-based cost allocation can be a complex topic as well. And curiously, we may encounter situations where if we truly want to identify the fully allocated cost of service delivery, we may need not one, not two, but perhaps even three different cost allocation methods in order to get to the answer of a question of how much does this mile or hour of service costs. So yes, is it a complicated topic? Absolutely. Does FTA guidance make it even more complicated than perhaps it needs to be? I would probably agree with such assessments. So let's see if we can't talk about some of the key underlying principles that will add some clarity to this most difficult topic. First and foremost, let's turn our attention to the financial-based cost allocation methods, and we're going to focus primarily on indirect cost allocation. For most of you looking at the participants and attendees, you're either with a transit agency or a state DOT, and it's indirect cost allocation that is the primary issue before you. The guidance in this area is not promulgated by any one executive branch of the federal government. An overarching organization, the Office of Management and Budget, is tasked with responsibility for articulation of policy and procedure in this area. I may make reference to a document called the Super Circular, more appropriately referred to as the Uniform Guidance under 2 CFR 200. And that is the governing directive that dictates what we should be doing either as a federal awarding agency, a state pass-through agency, such as a state DOT, passing through 5311 or 5310 funds to a lower tier recipient. This is the guidance that we all should be following in the development of and the review, negotiation, and approval of indirect cost allocation plans. OMB sits back and takes no position in terms of developing universal rules for the classification of costs. And this basically presents a tomato situation for those of us, because at one local agency in the state of Vermont, for example, might classify a particular budget line item as direct. Another agency down the road may call it indirect, and neither one will be wrong. As long as the accounting entity is consistent in its classification of costs as either direct or indirect, you're in good standing with overarching OMB guidance contained in 2 CFR Part 200. Now, most of us will probably agree that direct expenses are those that directly relate and strictly benefit only the public transportation program. So our supervisors, our dispatchers, our customer service agents, and most importantly, our bus operators typically would all be classified by any stretch of the imagination as a direct expense. Similarly, vehicle fuel, vehicle maintenance expenses are almost universally classified as direct expenses by the transit organization. Direct expenses, I think, are a little easier to ascertain either or classify either as a transit provider or as a state DOT. Indirect costs can be more difficult to ascertain. In particular, if the grantee is a multi-purpose organization and the agency or the entity delivers multiple program services, such as a local government or a nonprofit that does more than just the delivery or operation of a transit service. And typically, we like to classify anything that will be defined as an indirect cost into 2 general categories. Administrative costs, and these would be examples of these expenses might be in a nonprofit setting, the salary of an executive director, or any administrative staff that doesn't dedicate 100% of its time to the transit program, but may also be devoted to senior services or local health care. And their salaries benefit not just the transit program, but other programs as well. Similarly, if we're all housed under one building, the rent or the lease of that building, the utilities associated with that building, insurance, all would be considered shared expenses or indirect expenses, and in some instances appropriately classified as indirect cost. And again, to underscore this critical component, an entity just can't decide to start charging indirect costs to a grant unless it has an approved indirect cost allocation plan. And the development of that plan must follow the prescriptive guidance that's provided in an appendix to 2 CFR 200. We'll talk about that in a second as well. So let's talk about preparation of how, if my organization wants to claim indirect costs, how I go about doing this. And unfortunately, in too many instances, we have observed that people are not familiar because it's not an FTA promulgated document. People do not realize that they need to go to 2 CFR 200 and the respective appendice to get the governing documents on how to prepare an indirect cost allocation plan. And in its simplest form, an indirect cost allocation plan is nothing more than several procedural steps to develop a ratio of essentially indirect expenses divided by some direct cost base. So if we have an accounting system that is capable of segregating and dropping direct costs into its respective buckets or buckets, and capturing and segregating indirect costs and putting it in its respective buckets, we have the technical capacity to develop an indirect cost rate. And I would recommend there is some documentation in FTA Circular 5010, which is the award management circular. But more importantly, if you are a nonprofit agency, I believe it's appendix, and I've got it in a future slide. I believe it's appendix 4 and appendix 7, respectively, that will define procedural steps on how you put together an indirect cost rate proposal. And it is appendix 7 for state, local governments, and Indian tribal organizations. If you are a 501c3 nonprofit, you will look at appendix 4. I also want to call your attention to another document that is somewhat out of date, but in my mind provides the best step-by-step explanation of indirect cost rate proposal preparation. And it is a document that was prepared in the 1990s by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And unfortunately, as OMB guidance was updated in several iterations since the original publication of this document, HHS has disavowed the accuracy of this document. But sure enough, when 2 CFR 200 was promulgated and published in the Federal Register, that document cited a document known as ASMBC 10. And it has this long-winded title of Cost Principles and Procedures for Developing Cost Allocation Plans and Indirect Cost Rates for Agreements with the Federal Government. It lays out very specific schedules and tables of how you should present your financial data. And although the cost principles have been updated and articulated in 2 CFR 200, and you'll have to discount the outdated references to OMB Circular A87, this document still contains principles that you'll find very valuable in preparing a cost allocation plan. And although it is entitled A Guide for State and Local Governments and Indian Tribal Governments, it will provide excellent guidance for nonprofit organizations as well. So what do I do as a local organization who seeks to claim its indirect costs under my federal awards? I prepare an indirect cost rate proposal, and it has to be submitted to an organization known as the Cognizant Agency for Indirect Cost. Now, OMB really takes a high-level look at that concept of a cognizant agency and will only designate a cognizant agency if you are a very large non-federal entity, i.e. you must receive more than $35 million a year in federal financial assistance to get OMB's attention. For most of us who are participating in this webinar, we're well below the $35 million mark in our federal financial assistance. And generally the guidance that you should follow is that I should identify that branch of the federal government that typically on a 5-year rolling basis provides the most financial assistance to my organization. And that is the organization I should identify as my cognizant agency, and I should submit my indirect cost rate proposals to that cognizant agency. And hopefully that agency will respond in a timely fashion to your submission. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight here is that if you primarily receive fundings not directly from the federal government, but through an intermediate agency, a pass-through agency using 2 CFR 200 language, and this is exactly the situation that is described in the flow of dollars from FTA to a state DOT to a local recipient in the 5311 program. When you primarily receive monies through a pass-through organization such as the state DOT as the pass-through agency can assume responsibility to review, negotiate, and approve your indirect cost allocation plans. And so this puts the onus for this function of reviewing and approving plans on the state DOT. And so this is a very common situation. It's been our experience that many of the state DOTs have stepped up to the plate, have recognized their role, and have developed means for processing indirect cost rate proposals from 5311 funded transit agencies. Now, I have to say that there are some practical issues that confront the non-federal entity, and I speak from personal experience. It may be that there's a lot of money in the transit program today, and our apportionments of 5311 funds have never been higher. And this might represent an opportune time for an agency to ponder and consider development of an indirect cost rate proposal and claiming indirect costs under its federal awards. Yet you may be in a smaller state where the state's apportionment of funding to your organization may not be sufficient. It's just barely enough to cover salaries and fuel these days and may not cover your indirect cost. And that can be problematic. What is the point of developing an indirect cost rate if it's not going to get any additional funding to my organization? And that is a legitimate question for your organization to consider. So what is the point if it's not going to get me any more dollars to my organization? We would like to say in advocating that from an accounting standpoint, allocating shared costs or indirect costs is critical to the accurate computation of service-based cost allocation strategies, whether it's reporting under NTD, whether it's developing a price for a contract to the local senior center or to the state Medicaid agency, or whether or not you're trying to allocate costs between urban and rural interest. We believe that indirect cost accounting is crucial to developing accurate allocations to those respective end users. So we would advocate, even if it does not generate additional funding for your organization, it still represents a viable, meaningful practice for your organization. So to the naysayers, just simply say it will improve our decision making and our reporting under various federal requirements. Now, if you get into the weeds in the respective appendices to 2 CFR 200, there will be some discussions of different methodologies on how to compute indirect cost in a non-urbanized area environment. If you go to those appendices, you will see that both in the nonprofit arena and in the state and local government and Indian tribal arena, the simplified method is a viable method and generally will work for most smaller agencies. Unless you're a very large, complex organization, the simplified method will work for you. And again, the method can be boiled down to a simple arithmetic equation. It's a division, A over B, where A represents your indirect costs and B represents some direct cost base, and you have some options here. I generally recommend something called MTDC, or modified total direct cost, as a direct cost base. And that's as complicated as it gets. And if your accounting system can generate numbers to populate A and B based on past financial performance, indirect cost rates, the A over B, is typically generated based on historical or actual and preferably audited financial data, then you'll be in good shape, and the concept of developing an indirect cost plan may not seem so insurmountable. We do have to take a couple things into consideration when we include our total direct cost. We normally exclude capital and other distorting expenses. So if we, as a transit agency, contract with or pass monies through to a lower tier entity who is otherwise eligible for 5311 funds, then we would exclude that as a distorting item because it would create an imbalance. And you can read about that. Time precludes us from getting into the details of the computational steps, but I would refer you to 2 CFR 200. There is a methodology available to nonprofit organizations that I want to call your attention to. It's called the direct allocation method, and it is uniquely associated with the appendix for nonprofit organizations. If you have subrecipients who are public entities, they should not be using generally the direct allocation method. And this is something that's been around for a long time. It was designed to create a less burdensome method of claiming indirect costs for smaller organizations who have relatively few indirect costs. There was this philosophy at OMB that some smaller nonprofit organizations are so dependent upon federal funding for their day-to-day operations that they literally, every financial decision they make is predicated on, can we charge this expense to a grant or not? And if we can't, we won't incur the expense. And when we have those situations, we tried to isolate only those items limited in number and developing some equitable methodology of allocating that expense. So if we only incur shared expenses in the facility category of rent or utilities, we might allocate that to the benefiting departments using some sound basis, such as the square footage consumed in the building by the respective program or department. And if we only had to do that once or twice, that was an appropriate method. And it was relatively easy. And I do want to underscore it's only available to nonprofit organizations, and it's essentially a process of converting an indirect expense into a direct expense. And this is an example of the square footage example that I just cited that would indicate that 19.31% of rent would be allocated to Program 1 based on Program 1's consumption of square footage in the building. There are some dangers associated with this so-called simplified direct allocation method. Most accounting software is not structured to do these types of sub-allocations. And what we witness is that many organizations then export data out of the accounting system into Excel to do these computations. And we have seen multiple errors when such processes take place. There's no audit of the Excel spreadsheet, unlike an audit of the accounting records. And some entities take this simple notion and expand it exponentially, so they end up performing this simple allocation step not once or twice for facilities, but they allocate 15 to 20 to 30 different line items in the transit budget get allocated using this methodology, and they do it every accounting period. And we end up with hundreds and in some cases thousands of computations performed every month to compute a bill to the state DOT. And if you're in the position of a state DOT personnel reviewing that request for payment, it changes every month. It involves thousands of computation steps. It's virtually impossible to accurately review that request for payment. And so highly recommended that if your financial structure is that complex, do not use the direct allocation method. You're going to stumble over multiple landmines in that process, and we don't recommend that as a best practice. Perhaps what could be recommended as a best practice, and this is a whole new concept effective of the implementation date for 2 CFR 200. It's got a very odd name. It's called the de minimis rate. And this is an automatic 10% of your allowable expenses can be classified as indirect expenses. You do not have to prepare an indirect cost rate proposal. You do not have to submit any indirect cost rate proposal to a cognizant agency or to a pass-through agency. All you have to do is declare it, and every federal awarding agency and pass-through agency must recognize your declaration of 10% de minimis indirect costs. Now, there were some rules associated with the use of the de minimis rate, and one of the rules was that if you had ever in the history of your organization developed an indirect cost agreement with the federal government, you were barred from using the de minimis rate. And so we saw situations where nonprofits somewhere back in the early 90s had an indirect cost rate, but because of personnel transition, complexity, lack of available federal funds to support indirect cost reimbursements, they basically stopped claiming indirect cost. And then when this opportunity arose, December 26, 2014, they were interested in claiming 10% indirect costs, but then discovered because of some event from 20 years past, they were not allowed to do that. And so there was a lot of lobbying in this area, and in revisions to 2 CFR 200 that went into effect November 12th of 2020, that limitation was stricken from the rule. So even if your organization previously had an indirect cost rate with the federal government, you are now, as of November 12th, 2020, you are allowed to use the de minimis rate. So in my final 10 minutes here, let's focus on a couple best practices, and I'm going to target these first at the transit provider or agency level, and then I'm going to close with some state DOT practices. And my first bit of advice is to critically evaluate through computational steps what you project your indirect cost rate would be. Use your accounting records to develop the A over B methodology. If it is anywhere close to the 10% range, and my rule of thumb is it's between 10 and even 12%, it is probably going to be beneficial to your agency simply to declare the de minimis rate. Yes, if your internal computation shows 12%, yes, you are leaving 2% on the table. But the simplicity about the administration from both a grantor agency and the grantee status makes this such an attractive alternative, as I encourage you to seriously consider this. Now, if your computation showed that your indirect cost rates might be in the 15% plus range, then bite the bullet, study the appendix to 2 CFR 200, and prepare a full-blown cost allocation proposal. The good news is once you do it once, the same template can be used the following year, and virtually all you have to do is update the audited financial data. So you don't have to do a full-blown indirect cost rate proposal every single year once you get the base template developed. All you do is update it with the most recent set of audited data, and you resubmit to your cognizant agency or to your state DOT. Do understand the requirements for an indirect cost rate proposal. And if you lack in-house expertise to tackle those requirements, hire third-party CPA or audit firm assistance. I just want to caution you, do not use the CPA firm that does your single audit. That audit firm should tell you that they are precluded from participating in the development of your indirect cost rate. And do understand, oftentimes in conducting triennial reviews or compliance reviews, which we do, we will find instances where an agency will tell us, yes, we have an indirect cost rate. We ask for a copy of it, and sure enough, it was developed in 2011, and that's the rate they're using. An indirect cost rate should be updated annually. And so when you decide to bite the bullet and claim indirect cost, you are assuming some responsibility for the annual update of that indirect cost proposal. And again, try to look at the available funding that will be made available from either FTA because of the apportionment process, or in whatever processes the state DOT uses to allocate 5310 or 5311 funds to your organization. If in fact you can claim every penny that the state is going to make available to you as a direct cost, then again, I would fall back on this position that good accounting would represent use or would support use of indirect cost allocation for accounting purposes, but we have to acknowledge it's not going to bring home any more bacon to my community. And then finally, I would be remiss if you need a cost allocation tool to do service-based cost allocation. Robin previously mentioned RTAP's cost allocation calculator, and I would highly recommend use of that tool. And you don't have to learn all the ins and outs and details of how cost allocation is typically developed for service-based cost allocation. For state DOTs, the primary thing that I think all state dots when they're funding subrecipients who claim indirect cost, there's not a lot of training on this particular topic at State Transit Association meetings and state dot sponsored conferences. Some states have been in the forefront of doing this, but this is really something that in my mind is as important as drug and alcohol testing training, as ADA training, Title VI training. This topic deserves a place on the shelf with those priority topics, and we don't see a lot of this training being sponsored. As a consequence, agencies in the absence of in-state guidance tend to develop their own homegrown methodologies that are not compliant with the procedural outlines in the respective appendices to CFR 200. Similarly, if you know you have a lot of subrecipients who are going to claim indirect cost, I would try to devote some time to develop a standardized procedure, much like you may have developed a standardized application form, standardized application budget form, develop a standardized format for the submission of indirect cost. You'll want to see audited cost. You're going to want to see what they consider to be direct costs that make up the direct cost base, and you're going to want to see a template for what they consider indirect cost. And to the extent that you can standardize the presentation of financial data, the easier it will be for the state dot to review and understand the proposal being submitted by your subrecipients. And again, in the public transit units, we may not have the technical capacity or expertise to understand indirect cost rate proposals. If so, if there's any way you can piggyback on the technical expertise of somebody in a physical department, which is the very strategy I employed when I was a program manager at NCDOT, don't be afraid to reach out to a sister department within your DOT to provide that expertise. So training, standard forms, development of in-house capability. The other thing that I would bring to the attention of the state DOT is that while there is no requirement, it is likely that some of your subrecipients, you are not the primary provider of federal assistance to that organization. It may be a sister state department, such as a Health and Human Services department. And I believe it's prudent strategy for a state DOT to play nice in the sandbox with sister state agencies. So if we have a situation where a sister state agency has reviewed, negotiated, and approved an indirect cost rate from one of your subrecipients, you should accept that rate. You are permitted to do so. That's not articulated clearly into CFR 200, but there was a Q&A session, a Q&A document that OMB issued subsequent to the original issuance of 2 CFR 200, where OMB recommended that approach and suggested, and they actually used the example of a state DOT, that the state DOT should acknowledge the indirect cost rate approved by the sister state agency and should only require the subrecipient to develop a transit-specific indirect cost rate proposal if the state dot could substantiate that the proposed indirect allocation methodology did not represent an equitable distribution of indirect cost to the transit program. And I would think that that would rarely be a circumstance. So playing nice in the sandbox with approved indirect cost rates made, decisions made by other state agencies, in my mind, represents a best practice. And then finally, service-based cost allocation, use those existing tools that may exist, such as the National RTAP cost allocation calculator. And then as my parting thought, I would just leave you with this notion that service-based cost allocation has been built using old school philosophies, so that we are aiming to develop some estimate of what the fully allocated cost of a revenue hour or revenue mile of service costs. And in today's environment, particularly with recent CCAM guidance, suggesting cost practices for coordination of services between transit agencies and human service agencies, we may be confronted with this notion of creating cost estimates of the least path distance between a human service client's origin and destination. It's kind of what I call the Uberization of cost allocation practices, and it really is going to require cost allocation strategies 2.0, and they are under development and forthcoming. And stay tuned, there will be guidance coming out of the Federal Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility on that very topic in the near future. And so with that, I'd like to stop sharing my screen, and we have some additional participants in our workshop today. And I'm going to turn it over to Robin for introductions.
There we go. Thanks, everybody. We've been having a pretty interesting chat in the chat area. I would, one of the questions was about if you are, let's see, a county or a transit department in the county, and they benefit from the county government, would you, and they haven't been doing an indirect number, but if they did an indirect amount, what could they do with it? And I said, well, you could use that as match. So I know that for some tribal organizations, it's within the planning department. The tribe pays for the office space, the internet, the IT, the electricity for the transit program. And that money is then used to match the federal transit money, because that's in kind resources applied directly to the program.
That's a good answer, Robin. I would concur.
Would you to have all the other questions for this presentation answered before the next one, or just wait till the end?
It might be a good idea if I could recommend, Robin, that we hold the questions, because I think some of the materials that Pennsylvania and Vermont will present, they may actually present an answer to some of those questions. That was certainly our intent. So we have allocated time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Okay,
so here we go. John Taylor is up next. He's with the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, and I'm going to share his slide right now. There we go. Are you seeing your slides, John?
Yes, I see them.
Okay, well, let me know when you want to have it changed.
Okay, sounds good. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Taylor, and today I'm joined by Sheila Gambita, who's the Executive Director of Freedom Transit. So today we want to talk about the Pennsylvania Shared Ride Service. We feel that Shared Ride is a good example of, I'll say, successful coordination of human service transportation. And we're going to focus a bit on our medical assistance transportation program, which is our Pennsylvania's primary state Medicaid NEMT service, which is a component of that coordinated service. And again, we feel it's been successful. So overall, we're going to try to give an overview of what is Shared Ride Service, talk about a bit how the different providers of the shared ride service determine what to charge for that service to actually get the funding that they require to run it, and focus a bit on MATP's role in the service, as well as some challenges facing shared ride service. So since I'm from the state DOT, I'll be covering things at sort of a higher level from our perspective. And then Sheila has the hands-on experience as a transportation provider. So I'll be passing it off to her, and we'll be going back and forth. She'll be talking from more of her perspective as we go through the presentation. So to start off, this is just a slide that we usually share when we're PennDOT's doing a presentation. So I think the only thing I'll talk about here is off to the left in the middle, there's the 53 transit system. So PennDOT, a component of what PennDOT does is supporting public transportation service. We do have 53 transit grantees. In our particular case, we don't directly operate the service. I believe some states DOTs do have more of a hands-on direct role in actually operating the service. All of our transit agencies are independently operated. They independently make decisions about how much service do we provide, where do we provide service. PennDOT's role is really more providing funding, providing technical assistance, and other support of that nature. Next slide, please. Okay, to start off, we thought it'd be helpful to talk just about a couple milestones of the shared ride services history. So it really started back in 1980 with the program called Shared Ride for Seniors. And what this program is basically anyone in the state who's 65 or older can ride on shared ride service at a high discount. The percentage of that discount has changed over time. Currently, it's 85%. I know in the past it was 90%, and it may have been some other percentages over time. But that really started off shared ride, and even today, shared ride service is still mostly composed of senior trips. I think it's around half of the total trips in the state, at least pre-pandemic. That might have changed a little bit post-pandemic. Are still seniors riding. Now, around that same time, you had, of course, Medicaid NEMT starting across the country, and that quickly started taking advantage of the same service that was being ramped up to accommodate seniors on shared ride service. And then in 1984, we had the Community Transportation Capital Equipment Program. What this program focuses on is really providing capital funding with the primary goal of matching federal funds. So today that's matching federal 5310. And something that's allowed us to do is we use CTC, Community Transportation Capital, in conjunction with 5310 to buy the majority of the rolling stock, the vehicles that are being used across the state for shared ride service. As a result of that, the agencies are able to, when they're charging the rate to whether it's riders, they're charging it to our Department of Human Services for the NEMT service, that they're able to not have to factor in the cost of those vehicles, since those are being funded by the funding that we're giving them. And that's something we decided by policy to do a while back. So even though a vehicle at the end of the day might be traveling most of the time and carrying a majority of MATP riders as opposed to riders for our senior share ride or other program, we're still funding the capital cost of that vehicle, and that allows that transit agency to charge a potentially more affordable rate to other agencies as they're doing that service. So after the 80s, obviously in the 90s, we had the Americans with Disabilities Act and complementary paratransit starting up. That did and does significantly use the shared ride network. So a lot of the ADA service across the state is also on the same shared ride network that was originally started for seniors and was also being used by NEMT services. And then in 2001, as a complement to ADA complementary paratransit, the state Persons with Disabilities program started to be piloted. And really the idea with PWD, the PWD program, was to expand upon ADA. So ADA obviously generally stops at that 3/4 mile buffer around fixed route service, but obviously people with disabilities might have the need to travel beyond that, and it might be difficult for them to do that if they're not able to drive a vehicle themselves or have ready access to transportation. And there was a lot of lobbying being made at the state level by persons with disabilities saying like, hey, seniors are able to access this network of shared ride service at a discount through the lottery funds that's funding the shared ride program. We should have something else to allow us to use the same network when we're traveling beyond the bounds of ADA service. So that's where the PWD program pilot came into play. And that pilot did prove successful, and we did roll out PWD statewide. And we finally completed that in 2014 when we deployed to the last county that hadn't yet been deployed, which was Allegheny County. And that Allegheny County had previously been excluded just because of its ADA service originally covered the full county, and they later scaled that back. So we had to modify the law so that we could have Allegheny start doing PWD service. But today in the state, everyone in the state who has a disability can either use a combination of PWD and or ADA to basically get where they need to go using shared ride service. Next slide, please. All right, now to provide a bit more detail on what shared ride itself is. So it is non-fixed route service. We also fund fixed route service, but when we're talking about shared ride, it is just really demand responsive non-fixed route service. We do require that the service be open to the public, which means that the service is not supposed to just be offered to seniors or NEMT riders or persons with disabilities. All the providers in the state are required to offer the service to the public at the public fare. Now, the fare is how the agencies are really getting the reimbursement they need to run the service. The process of determining the fare involves figuring out your overall cost of service, estimating how many trips you're going to do, and most of the fares are distance-based, so you have to factor in the distance being traveled to determine, like, okay, what's the right rate for what ranges of distance. And so that's the basic reimbursement model for shared ride service. So like if I just want to ride shared ride tomorrow, I can call up one of the transit agencies and pay that fare. Now that fare is going to fully cover the cost of service less the capital costs. So it's probably going to be pretty expensive, like $20+. So it doesn't usually end up being a lot more competitive than like a taxi or an Uber Lyft type service. So in effect, most people riding the service are people who qualify for one of the programs such as PWD or ADA, but it is required that it's a public service and the options given to the public. And Sheila will go into more detail on how the fare structure is actually determined. I think the last thing I'll say is that like I said earlier, the service is run by the local entities. PennDOT, we have some oversight, and there's rules, of course, with our funding programs, and there's rules that come along with like our MATP statewide program that DHS issues that the agencies have to follow, and there's rules, of course, tied to ADA complementary paratransit that have been created or determined over the years. But at the end of the day, most of the parameters of the service really are up to each local provider, such as how far are we going out of county? If we go out of county at all, what days and hours do we operate? That type of thing. All right, next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sheila to start talking about some of the more specifics about how fare structures are developed.
Thanks, John. So just wanted to give a transit agency perspective about how we develop our fare structures. PennDOT does have an established fare increase application that we do have to submit for approval that looks at a number of different factors that can impact what the shared ride rate structure would be. Generally speaking, these first few steps, not necessarily in any given order, but we do want to determine what the expenses are. We identify all the eligible operating expenses for shared ride service and then calculate what the total annual cost is. Our costs are primarily direct expenses. There are indirect expenses that are typically allocated either by service hours or miles or some other factor like that. The second thing is to evaluate the trip volume by program and fare category. John had mentioned that most fares are distance-based. The fare structure is typically structured for a range of miles. For example, our first category ranges from 0 to 1.99 miles, which is based off a mapping system that calculates the miles from origin to destination, utilizing the shortest distance that can be driven on roads. So through our software system, we can calculate the total number of trips for each fare category. And then we look at the number of trips by program and fare category to get a sense of the volume of trips being provided, and is an important step, the next step. So determining the trip revenue by program and fare category, we're looking at reviewing the data from steps 2 and 3, which will help to identify trends among distances and programs. And later, when you're testing the rate scenarios, this data can be looked at to see if there are any opportunities for modifying the fare structure. For example, could 2 fare categories maybe be combined into one? Then we're looking at identifying projected gap in funding between the expenses and the revenue generated by the current fare structure. How much more money would you need to make ends meet? And then it's an opportunity to test different scenarios for increases to rates. experiment with increasing rates and evaluating the impact to riders. We know some riders are only partially subsidized. If the rate increases, can they afford it? Will that impact their ability to ride? And then trip sponsors and funding sources can look at what can they afford for an increase as well, show them the projected data with proposed rates to help guide their discussion. And then finally, you just want to finalize and establish the rate to meet or exceed expenses, or just to be in a better financial position. So the next slide, I think we might have skipped ahead there, was just a look at what the coordinated fare structure looks like in our county. Just wanted to provide an example again of what one of the a transit agency's rate structure looks like. If you can go back, that would be good. There you go. And then these rates were actually approved and implemented in September of 2018. But as you can see, we have 7 fare categories, and the full fare rates range from anywhere from $11.50 to $51.50. And then the required copays, whether you're a senior paying 15%, or in our case, in our county, our seniors for medical appointments have some sponsorship, so they only pay 7.5%. And then persons with disabilities are typically around a 15% fare as well. So that's what a fare structure would look like in that. And then I will turn it back over to John to talk about the shared ride trips on a statewide basis.
Okay, thanks, Sheila. So I want to shift gears and talk a little bit. I mentioned at the beginning, we want to cover some of the, I'll say the challenges. Overall, we do feel that shared ride service has been very successful from the standpoint of being a good example of coordination of human service transportation. But I think the model itself is starting to show its age. So the previous slide is just, or this slide is just showing the ridership for the last several years. So something that since I started with the department back in 2007 has been constant is each year we're seeing fewer shared ride trips than the previous year. And that's certainly, as I mentioned, most of the riders using shared ride are seniors. And in Pennsylvania, we certainly don't have a declining senior population, quite the opposite. And really what we think is more an indication of why this is happening isn't that there are fewer seniors, of course, it's that the seniors' behaviors are changing over time. So someone who's turning 65 today is a lot different in some ways than someone who may have become a senior back in the 80s when this program started. When shared rides started, a lot of trips ended up taking people to places like senior centers, and those would generally be shorter distance trips where they're picking up a number of people who lived relatively close to each other and took them to their local senior center. At least in our state, and I believe this is probably the case across much of the country, senior center participation rates have been declining sharply. And so there's fewer people going to places like senior centers and more people going to like medical appointments relative to all the trips being done. And those trips end up being farther, and there's fewer opportunities to group trips together. So as we can see here, you see the steady decline until COVID hits. And of course, COVID impacted shared ride like it hit much of the rest of the country, and shared ride service declined drastically with COVID. We don't quite have the the last fiscal year numbers finalized yet, but I think they're not going to be as high as 1920, but they're certainly going to be higher than 2021. And sorry, I guess I should have explained, our state fiscal year is June to July. So that's 2020 June to 2021 July when we say 2021, and that's used throughout this presentation. Next slide, please. So another challenge that sort of ties back to the ridership is how the agencies are getting their reimbursement using the fare structure. So as Sheila was talking through, and as I mentioned earlier, the fare structure is dependent on sort of predicting, one, what are your costs, and also what are your future trips going to look like, and you're setting your fare structure accordingly. So that works out if you're one, able to do it pretty accurately. But if something happens and your ridership goes down, there's a significant impact to your revenue stream, and you don't necessarily have a corresponding decrease to your expenses. So what this example is trying to show is first on the left-hand side, there's 3 people riding at a $16 fare, and that's covering the $48 cost of transporting those 3 people. One of those people drop out, and then there's the vehicle's still going to the same place at the end of the day. It's still transporting those 2 people, but to get the same amount of revenue to cover the same cost, because you still have the same driver driving pretty much the same distance to the trip, you now need to charge each of those people $24 to get the same total revenue for the trip that's being done. So that's one of the challenges with the service, and that's certainly become apparent. One, it's been apparent as ridership's been declining steadily over the years, but with the sharp decline in COVID, it's become a much bigger problem. So I think the next slide demonstrates or illustrates this pretty clearly. So what this slide is showing is for the same time frame of the ridership chart that we showed previously, what does the cost recovery for shared ride service look like? Now, the model for shared ride service is that theoretically you want, or you really want all of the revenue you're getting from the fares to cover the cost. So what that would look like is these two lines basically being the same on top of each other. It consistently since, at least since I started with the department, there's always been a gap where the cost per trip is slightly higher than the total revenue being received per trip. And that's been slowly growing, but as you can see with COVID, it really took off when all those trips dropped off, and our agencies certainly weren't running as many vehicles or incurring as much cost for drivers when most of the trips dropped off. But that doesn't mean it was directly proportionate to how many trips they were losing. So they might have lost like 80% of the trips, but their cost didn't go down by 80%. They might have gone down by like 40%. So that gap needs to be covered by something, and there's a couple different funding sources across the state that are used. There's counties contributing some of their county funds. There's transit agencies that are performing shared ride service that also perform fixed route service that use some dedicated transit funds, and there's other streams being used. But and with COVID, we were able to pull down things like the ARA funding and the other federal funds, but those funds obviously aren't going to keep coming. So we need to figure out something to make shared ride sustainable in the long term. And with that, I'll turn things over to Sheila, who's going to talk a bit about non-emergency medical transportation in Pennsylvania.
So yeah, just talk briefly about the NEMT program, as it is a significant part of our coordinated service in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Department of Human Services actually manages the NEMT program, which is also referred to as Medical Assistance Transportation, or MATP. DHS works with multiple types or models of NEMT providers in Pennsylvania, including county government, subcontracted entities of county government, local transit agencies, and one transportation broker agency in one county. NEMT is provided through those various models that are identified. If you go to the next slide, it kind of just breaks down the state of Pennsylvania and all of our counties and each of the different models. You can see that there's a variety of different colors all over the screen there. So each model actually drives the oversight and allowable costs for each county. And for the direct contract service provider, hybrid, and vendor models, counties are reimbursed based upon a single rate. The broker model, which only operates in Philadelphia County, operates on a per member per month capitated rate. Next slide. This shows the statewide data. So this is using the statewide software database, which includes all counties except for Allegheny, which is where Pittsburgh is located, and Philadelphia. And this chart basically illustrates the total number of shared ride trips for each fiscal year. The blue identifies trips that are essentially non-MATP trips, things like seniors, persons with disabilities, ADA, agency-sponsored trips. The orange denotes the MATP trips, and the gray identifies the senior trips that are sponsored by MATP. For these trips, these senior trips that are sponsored by MATP, PennDOT actually covers 85% of the trip costs through the lottery funding, and the Department of Human Services covers the remaining 15%. But as you can see from the chart, MATP makes up about a third of the overall shared ride service and plays a critical role in the overall cost structure of the coordinated shared ride system. If you go to the next slide, again, this is just breaking down our county, Washington County data over the last 4 fiscal years, just to provide an example of what was happening. Prior to COVID, the share of MATP trips was a pretty significant portion of our overall trips. And coming out of the pandemic, actually, MATP has become a larger portion of our trips for our county. So looking at this data, you can understand why transit agencies across the Commonwealth support PennDOT and DHS's efforts to collaborate and coordinate, or as Rich Garrity said, to play in the same sandbox. We think that allocating costs among multiple coordinated programs is economically more beneficial for those that are subsidizing the cost of the service and for passengers utilizing the service. Basically, the more passenger trips per hour, the lower cost per passenger trip. And turn it back over to John.
Okay. And now we just want to talk a bit about some recent history with MATP that's been of interest, certainly, and some of you might have heard this as it was happening in other states. So back in July of 2018, a law was passed that basically required our Department of Human Services to issue a statewide solicitation for a broker or brokers to administer MATP. So this was concerning to the transit providers because, as I would guess many of you have experienced maybe in your own states or neighboring states, a lot of times when a broker comes into a coordinated service and they start to take over the NEMT portion of it, a lot of times the previous coordinator of service loses a lot of those trips. So of course that was a concern in Pennsylvania if that would happen. And as a result of that, there was a lot of advocacy against the law or asking for the legislature to take a second look at that by transportation providers, by advocates from the disability community and other groups of that nature. So in response to that, in December of 2018, DHS I'm sorry, I skipped ahead. So in December of 2018, DHS issued the solicitation required by the July 2018 law. And then in June of 2019, a law was passed that required DHS, before they could actually award a contract for a statewide broker, to do a study in partnership with PennDOT and our Pennsylvania Department of Transportation and our Department of Aging to assess the impact of making this change, brokering out all of the MATP service before it could be done. And at the end of that process, when that study was delivered to the legislature, the state, there wasn't actually a law passed, but the state administrating agencies basically said, for the time being, we're not going to broker out the service, but we do want to continue to study it. So the group continued to study the issue and added in some transit agency participation to the group. And that finally culminated in just this past February when a second report was issued that basically outlined that this report didn't focus so much on the impacts of brokering out the service as it did focusing on how MATP could work with PennDOT and other entities to sort of just improve the overall provision of medical assisted transportation service. Next slide, please. So these are just some excerpts from the February report. So I'll just go through this quickly and maybe I'll point out places where some advancements have been made. So these are just the different recommendations that came out of the February report. So one was, of course, that HST collaboration or coordination continues to be advanced by the departments, and that we work together, which we have been doing a good job of. I feel like now that we work very closely with DHS and their MATP staff, probably more so than we did prior to the legislation and the studies that I just talked about. Kind of different. The next item talks specifically about instances throughout much of the state where Sheila was showing the chart that has the different coordinators of service. Most of the time where you see like a vendor or a service provider, that entity is also the shared ride coordinator. But in some cases, it's actually not. There might be a case where like the county is the MATP provider and there's a separate shared ride provider. So this is just talking about looking to see if there's opportunities for more coordination in those specific counties. The next is just talking about making sure that MATP is working with other entities before they make any decisions. And we've seen that DHS has been working with us and others before updating their standards and guidelines documents. The next item along the same lines is just consider making statewide standards jointly between the different state agencies that are funding human service transportation. Next slide, please. And finally, that we look to standardized processes. So we realized a lot of things like the Department of Transportation is asking of transportation providers is the same information that the DHS is asking from MATP providers, who often are the same entities. So we're exploring different ways to maybe standardize what we're asking so that agencies aren't spending time putting the same thing together twice in different ways. We're also looking to coordinate more on technology projects and DHS has been making more of an effort to actively communicate with their grantees, and they've been doing a good job of that. They have quarterly meetings with all their grantees, and we participate in those, and different entities participate in those. Next slide, please. All right, so a couple, I think we touched upon a lot of these. So obviously ridership has been decreasing since the pandemic. So that's something that everywhere in the country is basically looking into. We talked about the fiscal issue with how shared ride works from a reimbursement standpoint. PennDOT's advancing a couple different strategies at this time. One is we're exploring allowing agencies to do same day service. So we're piloting that currently our programs are the PennDOT's share ride programs don't allow for same day service. So we want to pilot what changing that rule may look like. We also have a lot of transit agencies that are piloting or experimenting with microtransit. So we're still evaluating what impact that may have on our shared ride service. Our transit agencies almost all have driver shortages, as I'm sure many of you on the call are also experiencing on your end, and also vehicle shortages with the impact from the pandemic on the supply chains of vehicles. Next slide, please. And finally, just a couple of the technology projects we're advancing, and I think I'll just quickly focus on the ones that we're really working closely with our Department of Human Services and the MATP folks with. First is EcoLane, which is a scheduling and dispatch system that we have deployed to all of our shared ride agencies, except for SEPTA and the Port Authority of Allegheny County. I think the primary thing there is it gives a lot of access to information, and that's information we're looking to leverage and share with the Department of Human Services so that we can both improve how we're administering these programs. The other one that I think is probably worth talking about is Find My Ride, which is sort of a brand of different services we're rolling out, intended to overall improve the access and accessibility of human service transportation. So we've been working closely with DHS in this initiative, and currently there's 3 parts of it. One is education, which is primarily meant to just inform the citizens of Pennsylvania of what services are available and what they can assist them with. Find My Ride Apply, which allows people to apply online for programs like MATP or Senior Shared Ride. And finally, Find My Ride Schedule, which is not as far along as the other 2. We haven't deployed it statewide, but that'll allow people to book their shared ride service online once that's rolled out. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Please, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We had a little issue with our chat in the middle of this, but I think we're going a little bit over, and so we'll make sure that all the questions are answered when we publish this presentation in our YouTube channel. So all the information will be put in that. So please do put your questions into the chat. Thank you both, Sheila and John. I just think it is really amazing. The thing is, everyone's fighting with the NEMT costs, and getting your state as being a leader in documenting the value that community transit brings to the table for medical transportation. So, Tim, we will probably go about 5 to 10 minutes after 4, so that Tim can have a chance to do his presentation. And this is Tim Bradshaw from Vermont Department of Transportation. Thanks.
Thank you. And you're gonna bring the slide up, Robin? Okay.
Oh, I have to do the share thing. Okay. I got the slide up, and I was like getting ready to show it, but I have to actually choose your presentation. And I had gone there. Yep.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Bradshaw from the Vermont Agency of Transportation. And I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. Next slide, please. So I'm probably going to be brief on some of these slides because I think they're going to provide the entire PowerPoints after this call today. So back in 2019, we worked directly with RLS, contracted with them because we felt it was necessary to kind of do a comprehensive review of all of our federal subrecipients around the state. We do have like standard reporting and monthly invoice templates that they submit to VTrans for preventive maintenance, admin, PM. We actually have CMAQ invoices that they have to submit separately. But we felt it was beneficial to have a more effective tool and transparency for how they're allocating their costs. You can go to the next slide. We're considered a pass-through entity, and we're responsible for negotiate and approve a subrecipient's indirect cost allocation plans. Of some of the things that Rich had mentioned. We do have one small urban system that does both 5307 and 5311 funds. Additionally, as Rich had mentioned, NTD is an important part of what we do to make sure that we're in compliance with NTD reporting policies and procedures. I'm not going to get into details with everything that's on that slide, but you can go to the next one. So some of the things that we did specifically with Rich Garrity at RLS is we kind of put together some objectives of what we were looking for Vermont to really tighten up our understandings of how our subrecipients are allocating costs. We conducted site visits at each state subrecipient. We evaluated their financial management accounting systems. We reviewed their financial health of each organization. We determined if the subrecipient employs sufficient internal controls and management of federal awards. Provide assistance to V-Trans in understanding the cost allocation procedures employed by each agency. Next slide. Have the consultant provide recommendations for improvements in financial management procedure for each subrecipient. Provide recommendations on the feasibility of adopting statewide uniform cost reporting requirements, which Rich talked about extensively. Recommend uniform procedures that V-Trans can utilize with its subrecipients to document cost allocation practices, and establish an evaluation framework for V-Trans staff to review and evaluate subrecipient cost allocation practices. Green Mountain Transit, I'm not going to get into too in depth into this, but they are a recipient of Urban 5307 and 5311 funds. They have both small urban and rural locations all under that one agency. Next slide. Other transit agencies in Vermont are subrecipients and provide services in the non-urbanized areas of the state. All 6 of these agencies incur direct, indirect, or shared costs that require allocation to a benefiting award or contract. V-Trans is currently working on what we would call our cost allocation 2.0, working with all of our subrecipients around the state. And this is just specific language that Rich had provided in his summary report about the requirements for an indirect cost rate or a de minimis rate. So on the site visits, I think we went one slide too far on the site visits. We go back one. There we go. So a common theme of the subrecipient site visits were a heavy reliance on Excel spreadsheets to perform the hundreds of computations needed each billing period to conduct the allocation process. The consultant discovered data entry errors at several locations as a result of these excessive amount of computations that they're doing. Consultant noticed that the Excel spreadsheets in many cases were not supported or integrated with the agency accounting software as a system of double checks. 2 subrecipients in the past 4 years merged transit divisions, but continued to maintain separate accounting records for each transportation division, even though federal and state awarding agencies impose no such requirements. This has since been resolved. Next slide. RLS also identified in the site visits opportunities to streamline practices by setting annual rather than monthly factors that could reduce administrative burdens on the organizations. Most recipients conduct the allocation process on a monthly basis, reallocating all allocation factors, but based on actual data recorded that billing, rather than establishing an approved indirect rate and truing up at fiscal year end, which is Rich talked about that as well. V-Trans will permit carry forward provisions when a fixed rate is negotiated in advance for a fiscal year. OMB permits the over or under recovery for that year to be included as an adjustment to the indirect cost rate determined in the next rate negotiation. When the rate is negotiated before the carry forward adjustment is determined, the carry forward amount may be applied to the next subsequent rate negotiation. This is similar to the practice currently employed by Green Mountain Transit with the FTA, and they have an approved FTA indirect cost rate that they update annually. At multiple locations, this study has found that key financial staff had not received sufficient training on crucial grants management requirements, OMB's uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards. V-Trans staff indicated that the state has sponsored no training on this crucial topic, deemed essential for any non-federal entity that receive federal grant funding funds. In one case, the chief financial officer was unaware such guidance had been issued. This is an essential knowledge that must be adhered to in the management of all FTA grants. FTA evaluates understanding, training, and credentials of financial staff and assessing compliance of its recipients and subrecipients. VTrans needs to demonstrate leadership in this area and arrange for all its grantees to undertake this training. And we're preparing to have some additional training soon. Throughout the process, some adverse comments have been rendered on the over-reliance on the use of spreadsheets as a supplement to the transit agency accounting software. Additionally, in some cases, personnel were not adequately trained in Microsoft Excel, and very little steps or internal controls were in place to protect the integrity of the data input or spreadsheet output. RLS and VTrans developed a cost allocation template. It was customized specific to Vermont. You know, the invoices that we have are customized templates that we use on a monthly basis. And Rich Garrity developed a pretty elaborate micro-based invoice and reporting tool that you could see as soon as they submitted their monthly invoices. You could see how all the costs were allocated into these defined object class definitions as cited in Appendix A, model chart of accounts for rural public transportation systems. The corrective actions negated some of the integrity concerns expressed during the site visits.
Okay, that was very quick. You
It
were
was quick.
amazing.
I do want to add that if anyone is interested in seeing, I mean, obviously this cost allocation reporting and invoicing tool was designed specifically for Vermont, but I'm happy to share it with folks so they could get an understanding of how we did it. It took a lot of work on Rich's part. We had several iterations of it before we got to the finish line. So happy to share it with folks.
So questions. Yes, people would love to see it. We can post that also with the slides when we post the webinar. We have
Possibly if it's a resource library, if it's something that can be uploaded in that way.
Yeah, I probably just want to confer with Rich. Rich was fine with that as well. Just want to make sure that what we do share, that all the macros are functional. So we did have several iterations of it. So I'll probably consult with Rich, and then I will provide that document for folks. But it has been extremely helpful for the state of Vermont so that we can kind of get a very clear snapshot of their financials and how they're allocating costs. Because there just wasn't the case before when we were getting the monthly invoices. We just weren't getting the level of backup that we were looking for with these workbooks.
I think my thing about cost allocation is good cost allocation makes good partnerships. You can't partner with other agencies, and the state has a hard time working with its subrecipients if there isn't clear cost allocation, strong cost allocation in place. So let's see. People are having to go to another meeting. And
questions. I don't know if the presenters want to stay on or if any attendees want to stay on for at least a few of them.
I can stay on as one of the panelists.
Okay. Super.
As can I.
Super.
I unfortunately have to drop off. So if John's able to stay on, hopefully he can answer. Thank you.
So go, Kara.
Okay. The first one is the FTA and TD representative has been stressing that we charge all costs such as fuel and maintenance as direct service costs rather than a service-based allocation. How do we mix the service-based allocation with a direct cost model?
And Kara, I've been trying to write up the answers to some of these questions during Tim and the Pennsylvania presentation. So I will supply a Q&A document in response to these questions. And in this case, I think the NTD people, frankly, have some blinders on because they're looking at scenarios where the transit agency has a dedicated fleet. so that we're using 40-foot transit buses for our fixed route service, and we're using, minivans for our complementary paratransit, and it should be no problem for a transit agency to directly account for fuel cost by those two types of vehicles. However, in smaller transit agencies, it is not uncommon for the very same type of vehicle to be used in both modes of service. And OMB states when the level of accounting effort is disproportionate to the accuracy gained, then that's a cost that should be treated as an indirect cost. And it's my opinion here, and I believe this is coming from Virginia, NTD needs to back down. If I were the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, I probably would fuss at NTD a little bit on that and acquaint them with some operating scenarios in less than large urban environments.
Okay, thank you for, doing a write-up. The panelists will be sent the questions and we'll have it a little more formal. The second question is for the state presenters. I'd be interested in hearing how states recoup indirect costs for administering 5339 programs.
So bus and bus related facilities.
Or Rich, if you want to take that one too.
Well, my write-up on this one was simply that, FTA has been gracious to, and it's embedded in transit law, that up to 10% can be used for state administration. And that's a feature that has always been a hallmark of the 5311 program. And you're now allowed to do it in the 5310 program. I'm unaware that there's any such allowance in the 5339 program. So absent an indirect cost, approved indirect cost rate for the state, there would, to my knowledge, there would be no recovery of admin cost. But I'll defer to Tim or a state official, Richard, if he's still on, to answer that question.
Yeah, that it is a good question. So I mean, I'm wondering if some of it is captured in their administrative costs, separate and distinct from their 5339 billings, but that's as far as I really have any feedback at this point.
Yeah, and that-
Yeah. Sorry.
On the Pennsylvania end, we don't use any of the federal funding for our admin costs. We have a trust fund that's used as part of our state funding to the transit agencies. That's also used for our admin costs.
Which is separate and distinct from the 5339 program, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And the next question was about preventive maintenance for cost allocation. How is that handled? Is it a capital award? Or...
Yeah, I believe the question centers on the fact that FTA provides a very loose interpretation of preventive maintenance and will enable an entity to claim 80% federal participation for its preventive maintenance expenses. But in their own guidance, FTA notes that that's just merely a reimbursement ratio. It's not an accounting classification. Preventive maintenance still is considered from an accounting standpoint an operating expense, and therefore would be treated like any other operating expense in an organization's approach to preparation of an indirect cost rate proposal. The only caveat that I would say here is if the preventive maintenance was performed in-house, there'd be no issues. If it is contracted to a third party, I suspect that a cognizant agency might dictate that the agency use modified total direct costs as the direct cost base in their allocation plan, because the level of administration for in-house cost varies from the level of administration associated with third-party contract administration. In modified total direct cost, you're only allowed to use up to the first 25K in your direct cost base. And to me, if I were in the chair of the cognizant agency reviewing the proposal and I knew the entity contracted its maintenance, I would allow them to use modified total direct costs as the base and allow them up to 25K in contract costs in their allocation formula. Otherwise, these third-party contracts will begin to distort the allowable amounts and will not reflect the level of effort of indirect cost burden being borne by the agency.
Thank you. The next question is about cognizant agencies, and if a plan is submitted and the agency sends a letter saying that the transit agency didn't meet the threshold, could the state dot use that letter and the cost allocation plan as a base to accept the subrecipient's rate?
Yeah, there's probably more than meets the eye to this question, and it appears as if whoever generated the letter saying it was below a threshold, there technically is no threshold. So this may be something that a state agency has adopted to perhaps minimize their workload. In that case, if I were the state dot then confronted with that situation, I believe it would be appropriate for the state dot to step up and assume the role of cognizance and review that documentation and approve an indirect cost rate on their FTA grant awards.
Thank you. The next question, a transit agency part of a county government benefits from the work of other county departments like IT, treasurer, and the clerk, and wanted to know how they capture that indirect cost benefits in cost allocation.
The expenses associated with the incurment of those costs by sister departments could be done as a direct expense if those departments were willing to keep the necessary documentation to substantiate and the cost to the transit program, which generally means that they would have to keep, in the case of personnel, time records that reflected their actual after the fact activity devoted to transit versus any other function of the municipal or county government. And that generally is a request that goes too deep and people won't do that. And so the only way to recover such costs is to bite the bullet and prepare an indirect cost rate proposal and get it approved.
Actually, the last question, the rest are comments. What about the acceptance of expired rates? If a subrecipient's rate has expired, should they immediately stop accepting those indirect cost rates? I assume that's from a state dot until a new rate is approved.
That's generally the protocol. What should have happened is the non-federal entity at the local level should have recognized that this rate was about to expire, and either the approving agency hasn't gotten around to approving the next cycle, the next fiscal year's rate, or they've been, because of personnel turnover or pandemic concerns, they've been unable to get their indirect cost rate proposal for the next year into the cognizant agency's hands. In that case, that should have been recognized, and a letter requesting an extension should have been issued to the entity that approved the indirect cost rate, and they should have asked for an extension. If memory serves me correct, you can ask a cognizant agency to extend your rate for up to a 4-year period. But the caveat would be is that you are now stuck. Once you ask for that and the cognizant agency approves it, you're stuck with that rate from last year for the full 4-year period, and you have to wait for the extension period to expire before you submit an updated indirect cost plan. So extensions are permissible, but you've got to be very careful about how long a period you request in that extension, because it could hamstring you down the road.
That's all the questions. Back to Robin.
Well, there we go. We are done. Thank you, everybody, for staying and showing your stamina as webinar people, both presenters and attendees. We have people stayed on. Please write in your questions. We'll be sending out evaluation tomorrow, and please give us some short, brief answers about how this worked for you. If there's anything else that you could use in this area, and we just appreciate our guests, Rich Garrity, Tim Bradshaw, John Taylor, and Sheila. So thank you so much and have a great rest of your afternoon. Stay cool. Do not get too much sun. Stay